William Wilson, page 337, published in 1839. The story presents a practical example of symbolism, for it turns on the fact that the second personage is actually William Wilson's conscience. The story experiments with blurring the line between external reality and psychological projections. The story is often called Poe's cleanest story, by which critics mean the one least cluttered with Gothic trappings, a story more like a parable of Hawthorne or a cautionary tale of Dostoevsky, in which the supposed fantastic event is easily explainable as a moral allegory. To see the double of William Wilson as his conscience is to make the story a simple parable that does not create the kind of uneasy ambiguity of some of Poe's other stories. Even the style of the story seems to differ from other Poe stories, reflecting a formality and order with a strong analytical and moral tone. When is William Wilson born? The story is largely autobiographical and follows two periods in Poe's life: his boyhood school days at Stoke Newington in England, and his misadventures at the gaming tables while a student at the University of Virginia. Even Wilson's birthday is the same, January 19th, although Poe lied about the year he was born, perhaps to make himself look even more like the boy genius. Plot. The story is a masterpiece of psychological fiction. The story is a man's struggle with his conscience, which is allegorized, objectified in another man of the same name and appearance, William Wilson, who meets his conscience first at school and spends the rest of his life trying to evade it. Wherever he goes, whatever he does, and he does some very vicious things, his counterpart inevitably catches up and exposes him. This specter pursues him from school to Oxford, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Moscow. Finally, during carnival time in Rome, William Wilson turns upon his tormentor. He corners the second William Wilson, stabs him to death, and realizes too late that he has murdered his own conscience and therefore has ruined himself. Character. The opening line, quote, "Let me call myself for the present William Wilson. The fair page now lying before me need not be sullied with my real appellation," on page 337. These are, as W.H. Auden first observed, the accents of lunacy, triple iterations, rhetorical inflations. While it is true that Wilson never rants in his narrative, unlike the narrator of The Telltale Heart, "Why will you say that I am mad?" the possibility of his own dementia never occurs to William Wilson. He is sane, cool, aware. But there is one circumstance in his life he can only report because he himself does not understand it. It is an urge to do evil. The story begins by calling attention to the fictional nature of the character's name. Although we do not know his real name nor his real state at the time of the telling, and as a fictional character, of course, he has no real name, we do know he perceives himself as an outcast of all outcasts, cut off from the sympathy of his fellow man. He declares that the motivation for his creating this narrative is to determine the logic and meaning of his experience. The fact that the story derives from the dreamy state of memory is indicated by Wilson's description of the quote, large, rambling Elizabethan house on page 338, that he remembers in a dreamlike place. The house itself he recalls as a structure incomprehensible in its windings and subdivisions, a place where one could not locate oneself. In the midst of this dreamy memory, he first meets the boy who is his exact double, bearing the same name, starting school on the same day, sharing the same birthday. The double differs from the protagonist by his, quote, intolerable spirit of contradiction, suggesting a split in Wilson like that caused by perverseness. The fact that the double perfects an imitation of Wilson and that his whisper is an echo of his own voice suggests his statue as a projective doubling. But the duplicate is not a caricature, as Wilson recognizes, but rather an exquisite portraiture which no one but Wilson can see. That the double is not the conscience of Wilson, but rather a perverse side of his divided self, is indicated by the fact that in the first section of the story, he has a sarcastic and sneering smile and chuckles at the success of his own imitation.
I looked, and a numbness and iciness of feeling instantly pervaded my frame. Not thus he appeared, assuredly not thus, in the vivacity of his waking hours.
What happened? Wilson is awe-stricken because even though he doesn't say it, he sees his own perverse self, his exact duplicate. Narcissus looking into the distorting mirror of the pond. The rest of the story documents quite straightforwardly the fact that Wilson becomes unscrupulous and a gambler, but is accosted by his double again when Wilson has cheated a man in a card game on page 348 and 349.
Upon my entering, he strode hurriedly up to me, and seizing me by the arm with a gesture of petulant impatience, whispered the words, "William Wilson," in my ear. I grew perfectly sober in an instant. There was that in the manner of the stranger, and in the tremulous shake of his uplifted finger, as he held it between my eyes in the light, which filled me with unqualified amazement. But it was not this which had so violently moved me. It was the pregnancy of solemn admonition in the singular, low, hissing utterance. And above all, it was the character, the tone, the key of those few simple and familiar yet whispered syllables, which came from 1,000 thronging memories of bygone days.
Then his double addresses the other players.
"Gentlemen," he said in a low, distinct, and never to be forgotten whisper, which thrilled to the very marrow of my bones. "Gentlemen, I make no apology for this behavior, because in thus behaving I am but fulfilling a duty. You are, beyond doubt, uninformed of the true character of the person who has tonight won at écarté a large sum of money from Lord Glendinning. I will therefore put you upon an expeditious and decisive plan of obtaining this very necessary information. Please to examine, at your leisure, the inner linings of the cuff of his left sleeve, and the several little packages which may be found in the somewhat capacious pockets of his embroidered morning wrapper."
Even as he calls him his, quote, arch enemy and evil genius, Wilson says, quote, "Let me hasten to the last eventful scene of the drama." On page 356, and indeed in the last scene, when Wilson is pursuing the young wife of an aged nobleman, he hears the whisper once again, and we have the final encounter in which the self battles with the perverse side. After plunging his sword repeatedly through his double, Wilson is horrified to see what happens to be a large mirror where none had been before. As he steps up to it, he sees himself with features all dabbed with blood.
Thus it appeared, I say, but was not. It was my antagonist. It was Wilson, who then stood before me in the agonies of his dissolution. His mask and cloak lay where he had thrown them, upon the floor. Not a thread in all his raiment, not a line in all the marked and singular lineaments of his face, which was not, even in the most absolute identity, my own.
When the stricken double speaks, Wilson says he could have fancied himself speaking.
You have conquered, and I yield. Yet henceforward art thou also dead, dead to the world, to heaven, and to hope. In me didst thou exist, and in my death, see by this image, which is thine own, how utterly thou hast murdered thyself.
To live aware of a split in the self rather than in a deception of the unified self is the thematic thrust of the story. So another interpretation is that the double just doesn't represent the conscience because the double has a devious motivation for his imitation. Indeed, the double changes to represent the opposite of whatever William Wilson is. He is a reverse perverse reflection, as all reflections are. The theme of the story, the conflict in one's mind between good and evil. Robert Louis Stevenson apparently had William Wilson in mind when he wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which also analyzes a man according to his good and evil tendencies. William Wilson is perhaps the most vivid and memorable of romantic tales of the divided self. It succeeds in objectifying the twin, irrepressible impulses to do evil and to judge oneself. In Freudian terms, the conscience or superego is murdered by the id. But how can the evil-doing part of the ego survive the murder of judgment? It is not clear whether, at the end, when William Wilson sees his own bloodied face in a mirror where a moment earlier no mirror stood, he does survive the murder of his doppelganger, or whether he speaks his lurid confession from beyond the grave. If he survives, he does so in a condition of madness which his exasperated prose style embodies and reveals. In the end, whether the second Wilson exists as a supernatural spirit or as a construct of the mind of the narrator remains ambiguous, as in other Poe tales, though the clues for a double reading are carefully planted. Again, the world that we perceive as readers is filtered through the subjective mind of the narrator, and it is this structure, along with some absurdist motifs, such as the precise timing of the double's entrances and his recurrent whisper, that gives rise to the dramatic irony of the tale. Certainly, if the second Wilson is the product of the imagination of the first Wilson's behavior must seem to his companions, if not comic, very peculiar indeed, along the same lines as the interpretation of the telltale heart that the narrator and old man are one and the same. Ultimately, of course, the tale is a dramatization of the ultimate perversity of self-vexation and destruction. and the final emptiness of the mirror into which Wilson is left staring is a symbol of the illusory nothingness on the other side of appearances. The tale involves doubles and dramatizes a distorted universe as perceived by a totally subjective mind.